Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Russell Houlden. I'm with RenderPlus Systems, and I'm thrilled that you could join us this afternoon for this introduction to IRender nXt. I have a few things to mention before we get started. First of all, it doesn't matter if you have experience with IRender nXt. Perhaps you've just installed a trial version of our software. And actually, it doesn't even matter if you have experience with high-end renderers at all. Maybe you're just looking for some ways to improve your SketchUp models. In either case, you've come to the right place. My goal this afternoon is that by the time we're finished, you'll be able to open a SketchUp model, load IRender nXt software, and create really spectacular renderings of the models you've created. That's where we're headed this afternoon. I'm going to record this webinar, and when I'm finished, I'll upload the video to our YouTube channel. If you weren't aware that we have a YouTube channel, point your favorite browser to YouTube and then look for the RenderPlus Systems channel. This is a really nice resource for learning about advanced features of IRender nXt. Some of them are published by us, others are published by actual users of the software. In both cases, you'll get some very nice tips and tricks on how to create spectacular renderings with our software. So you may even consider bookmarking the RenderPlus Systems channel on YouTube. Visit it often and take advantage of this valuable resource. Additionally, our website, renderplus.com, has lots of information on our software, including written tutorials, links to videos, lots of information that we have published, including our webinar schedule. We update our webinar schedule frequently, and we are in the process of adding new webinars all the time, all geared toward providing some instruction for novice and expert users of RenderPlus software. Now, I don't necessarily know exactly how you use SketchUp in your office, so today I'm going to use three models that'll take us through some of the IRender nXt features. We'll start with a very simple wooden table. We'll make some nice renderings. Then we'll go on to something a little bit bigger. This is a beach cottage model. The interesting thing is that this beach cottage actually came from the 3D warehouse. And when we load this model, we don't really need to do anything except click render. Similarly, I made a model of a little small home office, and once this model is created in SketchUp, in IRender nXt, there's really nothing we need to do except start to create our renderings. So three very nice models that we'll use today to help us get through some of the features in IRender nXt. If you have questions while we're going through this webinar, please ask them as they occur to you. I actually have the question board up in front of me. I'll try to catch questions as they're asked and then answer them. If later on a question occurs to you about a topic that we may have already covered, please write down the question anyway, add it to the question board. If we need to back up, I'm very happy to do that. Also, I have a tendency to speak a little fast. If that's the case and I need to slow down, type the word fast as a question. And when I see that, that'll be a good prompt for me that I need to slow down. All right, let's get started. I appreciate your being here this afternoon. And again, I hope that by the time we're done, you're going to be really confident that you can fire up IRender nXt software and create some really nice renderings of your SketchUp models. So thanks again for being here. Now, if you have installed on your computer a trial version of IRender nXt, when you start SketchUp, click the Extensions tab, and when this drop-down menu appears, select IRender nXt 6 Load. That will load our interface. Now, typically, our menu is going to load adjacent to the SketchUp interface. I peeled it away so that I can get us more focused on IRender nXt functions and not necessarily have them crowded with SketchUp functions. You can certainly do the same, or you can leave the IRender nXt interface docked with right alongside the SketchUp interface. I want to point out one other thing that I want to encourage you to do. This little brush is a materials interface, and when you click it, one of the options is to load the NXT library. This is a RenderPlus IRender nXt library of materials. It has lots of very nice materials that are not available to just SketchUp users. We think if you load this library, you're going to have a lot of fun with some of the materials that we have included as an extension to SketchUp. The materials library is absolutely free. The first thing that you need to do is you need to download it. Then when you download it, install it. When you click download, it'll take you right to our website. It's a link, and you'll notice here's a link to the downloads page. So first, a little description of what we're allowing you to install. Go to the downloads page, and it's the IRender nXt libraries. Click download. Once you install it, browse for the NXT materials folder, and when you've done that, you have lots of additional materials that you can use in your SketchUp models. Here's one example, some tiles that we've provided. Lots of very nice materials for you to explore. We also include materials that were created by Arrowway. That's a company. And I think in a couple of weeks, what we very well may do is have a special webinar focused on Arrowway materials. All right. Let's get started with our table model. Now, I mentioned that typically, once we've created a model in SketchUp, the only thing we need to do once we have that model loaded is click Render. That's what this little green dot is for. When we click Render, this dialog appears. This is the Render Settings dialog, and this one is specifically focused on the things that we need to set so that we can create a rendering. And as you can see, there's not really a whole lot involved here. Across the top of this menu are lighting presets. And so the first one I want to show you, we're going to use most of these during this webinar. The first one I want to show you is called Studio High Dynamic Lighting. That's kind of a strange name, but here's what it means. If you actually had a table and you wanted to include an image of this table in your catalog, you might consider taking the table to a professional photographer. And of course, the photographer in his studio sets up lots of really nice lighting, filters, gels, all that cool stuff. And once that's done, gives you some nice photographs of your table. Studio High Dynamic Lighting emulates exactly the same process. So once we select Studio High Dynamic Lighting and click Start Rendering, here's the model that we get. And this is actually quite interesting because you'll notice at the bottom below this table there are lots of shadows going on. So there's more than one light pointing at our table. Gives us a very nice rendering of this table. Now, when you are creating a model in SketchUp, there are a couple of things that will help you achieve realistic renderings of your models. First, it's important to start with a nice material that is photoreal, which we've done with this table. We have an actual photograph of a wood surface. To enhance the material and make it look more real, we need to also consider the finish on the wood. Now, what we've done is we're going to just click on the surface of this table. And this may not be obvious to you at all, especially if you are brand new to IRender nXt. I am currently looking at the IRender nXt render window. And what we frequently will not require you to do is return to Sketchup in order to make some changes to the model. Now, the changes that you can make are limited. However, one of the changes that we can make can be accomplished when you just click on the surface of the table. That will cause this dialog to appear, little pop-up menu, and one of the options is Edit Material. So imagine this. We've finished a rendering of our table. We want to make some subtle changes to the material. Instead of returning to SketchUp, click on the material, then select Edit Material from the pop-up. That will bring up this dialog, which is the Edit Material dialog. When we click on the Default tab, here are the Finish options for materials. And among them, we'll look at a couple of these today. One of them is reflective. So right now, in the original rendering that we created, the wood is actually pretty flat looking. It's not very shiny. What I'd like to do is I'd like to change the finish to give this table more of a polished look. So all I do is click reflective. Once I've clicked reflective, click OK. That removes the dialog. And now let's render. So now I have a more polished looking tabletop. Now again, this is a rendering that's created with Studio High Dynamic Lighting. Just think of that as taking it to the photographer's studio. I have a really nice wood surface, and now I've given it some reflections. The biggest benefit is that with Studio High Dynamic Lighting and reflections turned on, I'm able to sample this wood material in direct light, in filtered light, and then also in shadow. What Studio High Dynamic Lighting is doing is it's providing a rendering of our model as though the sun were filtering down through a canopy of trees onto our model. And it's doing this with multiple sources of light. That's why I have so many shadows underneath this table. And I have to tell you, I don't know how many there are, but I would imagine there are at least 8 light sources shining on our model. And the more I count, it's probably even more. So we select Studio High Dynamic Lighting and we get a really nice rendering of our model. And this isn't just appropriate for objects like tables. You can actually use Studio High Dynamic Lighting at any time that you've got a model ready to render. It's a nice test of your model. I wanted to point out this little blue dot with the arrow because I think this is also a feature of IRender nXt that may not be that obvious. Once a rendering is completed, and what you'll notice across the bottom of the screen is that this is a rendering completed in only 10 passes. Every additional pass will improve the quality of the rendering and improve the quality of especially the lighting solution. If I click this blue dot, that brings up this dialog. And you can see that the current rendering was completed in 10 passes. So what I've done is I've clicked on double up. That set now bumped us up to 20 passes. That means 10 more than what I did. And when I click OK, this is going to resume the rendering. So we're going to start on pass 11 and finish at pass 20. Once I click OK, the rendering starts. And you'll notice that now the dot that was green turns red and the blue dot is disabled. The red dot means if I click it, I can stop this rendering anytime that I want. The default in IRender nXt is that the rendering process will stop at the end of the current pass. You can't override that and require the software to stop the rendering process immediately if you'd like to do that. Again, once the rendering is completed and 20 passes are finished, our rendering is more refined, the lighting solution is nicer, it's improved, and again, I can click the blue dot, add more passes, and then click rendering to resume the process. The point is that it's not really necessary for you to guess at the number of passes in your rendering that are going to be required to achieve the result that you need for maybe your presentation to a client. Take a nice guess. You can be a little modest about it. Maybe 20 passes seems like that would be fine. If you believe once 20 passes are complete that 20 more passes would make your rendering even better, then click the blue dot, double up the passes, run 20 more, and in the end, you're going to have renderings that are just absolutely spectacular, and you're going to be ready to go to your meeting. The biggest benefit is that we don't require you to return to SketchUp, adjust the number of passes, and then start again at 0. So this is just a wonderful feature of IRender nXt that I hope you'll take advantage of when you're creating renderings of your models. We frequently get asked about the ability in IRender nXt to create renderings that maybe aren't quite so photorealistic. So here's one example. Maybe this is kind of an obvious one. I just removed the color saturation and made a grayscale image of exactly the same rendering. So that's one option. Another nice option that we have, and I think particularly helpful, especially when you just want to check the integrity of your geometry, is to use a clay model rendering. So here's exactly the same model, materials suppressed and overwritten by our model in shades of white, as though it were made out of white clay. Also a pretty nice rendering of the model. Here we've removed the material and we've rendered the model again, same lighting solution, same number of passes, but this time in just the color of the surfaces from SketchUp. Now I added this one because this is a crayon rendering. This actually is available not in IRender nXt, but in 3D Design Studio. So 3D Design Studio is IRender nXt plus even more features. You can investigate the additional features on our website, and perhaps the 3D Design Studio solution has some additional features that are very important to the way that you intend to process renderings of your projects. Here's my final rendering of the table. And at this point, I've actually covered a fair bit of ground and probably gone pretty fast. So if there are questions about any of the information that we've covered so far, please feel free to ask. And while I'm waiting for any potential questions, I want to mention again that this is a rendering of a nice little wooden table that we've created. We created this rendering using a lighting preset in IRender nXt called Studio High Dynamic Lighting. The benefit of this lighting preset is that I get a nice sample of this table in bright light, in filtered light, and of course in shadow. The biggest benefit of all is that now when I use examples of this table in virtually any lighting solution in a larger model, I can rest assured that this table is going to render very nicely. So Studio High Dynamic Lighting is a wonderful way to test materials of your SketchUp models. I'm not gonna stay on this image too long, but I wanted to insert this image because in addition to lighting, it's very important to understand that in this model I have one light, and it's actually a spotlight pointed straight at this wall. and it's the only light being used to illuminate this model. The other surfaces in the model are being illuminated by light that is bouncing from surface to surface. Obviously, the brightest light is on this wall, where the spot is hitting the wall, and then the light is bouncing off of this wall onto all of the other surfaces. And this is actually quite sophisticated because in addition to all of the other walls and the ceiling and the floor being illuminated, the back of this column is actually getting light being bounced off of this brick wall. Now, the brick wall naturally will not reflect as much light as a white wall. It still, however, reflects sufficient light to illuminate the back of this column. There's also a wall that you can't see that's over my shoulder that is adding light to the side of this column. So important to understand that direct lighting certainly illuminates surfaces. With IRender nXt, bounce lighting is also contributing to the overall luminance of your rendered image. This is a beach cottage model from the 3D warehouse, and once that model is open, with IRender nXt, you can just render it straight away. Now remember, when we click the render button, we get this nice rendering settings dialog. And for the first rendering of this beach cottage, I just want to create an exterior rendering, and I want to use the Sketchup Sun position to cast shadows. Once that preset is selected, click Start Rendering, and here is our rendered image. This rendered image is also using the SketchUp sky. Of course, we render it pretty nicely with IRender nXt. And so even though the sun position is the primary source of shadows on our building, the SketchUp sky is also illuminating the model by the software selecting and using other light sources. That's why every surface of our model is actually being illuminated. So this is not a one light source rendering, it's multiple light sources. And even though dark, there actually is some light being reflected up onto the underside of this porch. You'll also notice that along this wall, I think it's particularly interesting how the sun shadow is casting a pretty nice, the sun is casting a pretty nice shadow behind this overhang. But because of bounced lighting, the more exposure that this wall has to light from the sky, the more illuminated it is, which you can see as we move from the top to the bottom of this wall. Equally interesting is that the windows are reflecting the sky. Now, we can actually improve on that a little bit, so we'll get better reflections. And I want to do that, again, without requiring you to return to SketchUp and make adjustments to your model. We're going to take advantage of a very nice IRender nXt feature. And that's available from this dialog, which is the Tone and Filters dialog. The Tone and Filters dialog is actually very straightforward, and it includes features that you might otherwise only expect to get from an imaging program like Photoshop. So we provide a lot of those features with IRender nXt, making it possible to make adjustments to your renderings without having to export them to some imaging program. So for example, what I'd like to do is I'd like to improve the reflections in the windows, and one way to do that is to just increase the brightness of my rendering. So I'm going to bump up the brightness of my rendering 10 points from 50 to 60, and already you can see that the reflections of the blue sky are improved. And since now there's more light going into the model, I can actually see into this room, and I can see the difference between the wall and the ceiling. So the rendering is improved quite nicely. However, one of the things that happened when I brightened the model was that I lost some of the detail in the siding. The remedy for that is to use the sharpen filter. And if you'll just watch this part of the rendering, when I click sharpen, the detail is restored. So now I've brightened my rendering, improved the reflections in the glass, which I think is important. That's a wonderful feature of high-end renderers, and IRender nXt does a spectacular job with reflections. And then by using the sharpen filter, I was able to bring back some of the detail in my siding. Let's improve this even further. Another way to get to the settings dialogues in IRender nXt is to click on this clipboard icon. And when I do, the first thing that I get is another interface to the lighting presets. One that I'd like to introduce you to that you'll probably, for exterior renderings, use more frequently than any other is to use an HDRI sky as the lighting solution and also as the background for our rendering. So we select it, and then again, once selected, all that we need to do is click Start a Rendering. Now the SketchUp sky has been replaced with a high dynamic range image of a sky background. So you'll notice some nice fluffy clouds, and more importantly for my project is that there are now clouds rendered as reflections, all coming from this high dynamic range image. Now, just like the SketchUp sky, multiple lights are being selected from this HDRI background, and so all of the surfaces of our model are being illuminated. The shadows are subtle and very, very nice, and of course the walls are illuminated very well from this HDRI sky background. Interestingly enough, I can see even better now through the glass, as well as take advantage of these very nice reflections in the glass. Again, without having to return to SketchUp, we also include some very nice effects that can be applied to a completed rendering. One that's very interesting is the ability to introduce haze. Now, the reason why I want to do that on this project, this adjacent building is actually not part of my project. My project is just this cottage. And so for the purposes of my presentation to the client, I want to separate that building from mine. This little arrow means that you can just point anywhere on the model, and that'll be the limit of the haze. Then once you increase the strength of the haze, you can see that it's added immediately, and so now I've just pushed this building further back from mine. So that'll keep my client focused on the wonderful project that I've put together. Here's the final rendering. Again, wonderfully illuminated with an HDRI sky, beautiful reflections in the glass, and now a special effect that separates the neighboring building so that I can keep the client focused on this terrific project I've put together for them. I'm going to pause again. In the event that anyone has a question they'd like to have answered. We've focused quite a bit on the notion that once a rendering is created, if you'd like to enhance the rendering or make improvements, it's not always necessary to return to SketchUp. Sometimes the more efficient approach is to use the tools that we provide in the rendering window, make the adjustments that you'd like to make, and then save that rendering for your presentation. That's a lot faster than returning to SketchUp and starting a whole new rendering from scratch. Now this is a really nice rendering of our project, and what I'd like to do is introduce you to the IRender nXt lighting channels. There are 8 lighting channels available to you in IRender nXt. Lighting channels, just like some of the other tools that we've looked at this afternoon, can be used to alter a completed rendering. So I have this nice bright daytime image of my model ready to go for a presentation. And now what I'd like to do is I'd like to modify this rendering to create an evening rendering of my model. And I'm going to do that again without returning to SketchUp by just using the IRender nXt feature of lighting channels. So the first thing that I'd like to do for an evening view is I'd like to just turn the sun off. Checked means on, unchecked means off. And you'll notice that what happens is the shadow here and the shadow here on the wall immediately go away. Now the only lighting being used to illuminate my model is from the HDRI sky. In order to make an evening view, the next thing I might want to do is dim the sky. So I went from 0.8, that's the brightness that I'm using for the daylight image, and I'm going to bring that down to 0.2, more of an evening look. Now once it starts getting dark, the next thing I might want to do is turn on some artificial lights that I added to the model. Because they're unchecked, they're currently turned off. When we check them, they turn on. And now we'll remove this dialog. So from one rendering, which was a nice daytime image of our model, I used lighting channels, turned off the sun, dimmed the sky, and then turned on my artificial exterior lighting, and I have a really nice evening image of my model. Now that was a lot more efficient than returning to SketchUp and requiring my computer to create a whole new rendering for me from scratch. So we're very keen on this idea that if we can provide you with opportunities and features and functions that will let you create multiple renderings from one completed rendering, we want to do that. And hopefully so far you've seen several great examples of how that can be accomplished with IRender nXt. Now look at the difference in this model. This is a rendering, same model. The only difference is I'm using a different HDRI sky. This is actually one that's available in IRender nXt, and it's called Sunset. I like this rendering because the rendering of the building is much warmer than the bright daylight rendering. Here are the two side by side. So here's the bright daylight rendering using one of the HDRI sky backgrounds that we provide with IRender nXt. And then I switched it to a sunset image. So not only is IRender nXt processing multiple lights from these HDRI backgrounds, additionally, the color of those lights is influencing all of the surfaces in our rendering. A much warmer rendering of our model. And to make it more interesting still, I went back and I modified all of my artificial lighting and changed those lights from just bright white lights to a warmer look. I think more what incandescent light bulbs would probably look like with this model. What I'd like you to come away from with in this part of our webinar is that we provide a lot of flexibility in allowing you to control the quality of your rendering, and we provide a lot of options, various HDRI skies, for example, that can actually have quite a dramatic effect on the finished rendering that you'll show your client. Anyone using IRender nXt have experience yet with using the HDRI backgrounds to light your models? Let me put it that another way. If you've tried the HDRI sky background, just type the word yes as a question. Okay, and I'm getting lots of people typing in yes, so people do have some experience with that. You also have the ability to go grab HDRI images off of the internet and import them to use as your own custom HDRI skies. So a lot of flexibility. Here's a little office model built with SketchUp, and now we're going to render it with IRender nXt. So as I generally do, once I have a model loaded, I'm ready to render. And the first thing I thought it might be appropriate to do is to introduce you to some render-ready components that are included with IRender nXt. To get to them, you just click on this little chandelier. That brings up this dialog, which is the render-ready components. Now, just like loading a model from the 3D warehouse, when you use a render-ready component, what that means is we're going to add, for example, some ceiling lights to our model, and as soon as they're added, they are going to add light to our rendering. So 2 ceiling lights added to our model. Now I return to the render-ready components. I'm going to select this desk lamp. We're going to place it on this shelf back here. You'll notice that the desk lamp is a black desk lamp, very nice, actually perfect for virtually any model. Once I added it to my model, I actually changed the color to make it look more like brass. So you are able to use these components exactly as they install from the render-ready components library. And of course, because they're just SketchUp models, you also can edit them in any way that you see fit so that they'll fit into your model properly. Any surface in a SketchUp model can behave as a light. So this picture of this sailboat, this actually isn't a picture, it's a television. And so in order to make it look like a television in our finished rendering, what I'd like to do is I'd like to make it into a light source. When I click on this surface, this dialog appears. And one option in the IRender nXt set is set the object properties. You're going to be surprised at how easy this is to do, especially if you haven't tried it yet, because the only thing necessary is to treat this object as a light and specify how bright this light is going to be. That's it. Once you're done, click OK. Voila. The TV screen is now a light. So let's render this model. Now, another one of the lighting presets has been selected. So this is now the 4th. We've used Studio High Dynamic, we've used HDRI, we've used Exterior with Sun. Now we're going to use Interior with Sun. That's going to let the sun come in through the window that I have on the end of this model. And the one that's going to be left kind of an orphan by the end of our webinar is interior no sun. Click Start Rendering, and here's our rendered model. Remember I told you I modified the lamp so that it looks more like brass. That actually worked quite well. The two lights that we placed in the model are now illuminating our space. Along with the lamp, the television is actually turned on, and of course we have these two sconces on the wall. So, once the rendering is completed, this is perfect for the presentation I have coming up, but I want to try some additional things as well just to see if I can squeeze another rendering out of this one that was created. For example, this column is, it's actually nice as is, but one option that I'd like to show my client is I'd like to show them this column as though it were wrapped in maybe metal. Just like we did with the table earlier, we click on the column and we bring up the Edit Materials dialog. What I would like to do is just change the finish on this column. The default was that it was a matte finish. I'm going to click on Metal, select OK, and now let's re-render this model, and we get this option for the column wrap. So now instead of flat paint, it's wrapped in a shiny metal. Again, one feature of IRender nXt is that we accomplished this without having to return to SketchUp. I wanted to just show you what this rendering looks like when I change the color of the lights away from bright white to more of an incandescent color. So this is the license that you have when you're creating your renderings, to not only specify how bright lights are, but also use color on the lights to your advantage to create a rendering that's going to be as photoreal as you can possibly make it. Here we are back to the rendering with white lights. So you can see quite a dramatic difference. Now, just like I did with the beach cottage, I'd like to stay in the render window and just try a few changes on this model to see if I can squeeze another rendering out of what's been processed. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to dim the brightness of the model down 10 points. So it was 50. I'm going to dim it down to 40. And similarly, the saturation, this is color saturation. So it was set fully saturated at 100%. I'm going to dim that down to 70. And once I do that, here's what I get. Now, the reason that I felt like lowering the saturation was important is because, as you know, in a dimly lit room, there's less light bouncing around, and so colors become quite a bit subdued. My personal preference is that in a dimly lit room, I lower the value of all of the colors to give me a more realistic, dimly lit room. Let's go back to lighting channels and see what we can do to improve this rendering further. First thing I might want to do, for example, is turn the sun off. Or excuse me, turn the sky off. So you'll notice that as soon as the sky is no longer being used to illuminate this model, the window, let's back up. So here's the sky on. Let's turn the sky off. And now all of a sudden, because it's darker outside than it is inside, without me doing anything, the glass in the window starts to behave more like a mirror, and I can actually see a reflection of these sconces on the wall. All by just turning off the sky. So now let's brighten the TV, because in a dimly lit room it would be a little bit brighter. So the TV started off at a value of 100% bright, and now I'm actually improving that 500%. The sun is a little bit bright, so let's dim that down. Oops, excuse me. I guess the first thing I did was I turned off the ceiling lights. You know what, and I'm sorry, I actually have things in my way so I can't see what's being pointed to. Okay, so the ceiling lights. Here they are on. When these get turned off, it's really interesting to pay attention to the walls and even the brick walls, where not nearly as much light is being reflected as from a white wall. But watch this brick wall, and when the ceiling lights get turned off, watch how they dim. Ceiling lights on, and then ceiling lights off. Now, the sun, full on, it probably makes maybe the most sense to turn the sunlight, to just turn the sun off. But what I thought it was, if I just dim it, now I'm getting the appearance of maybe the moonlight shining through the window. Now this image is actually probably way too dark, so I went back to the brightness filters and I brightened it back up just a little bit. So I still have a pretty nice, more dimly lit room, but a rendering that I can actually show my clients, and it's not as though all the lights are turned off. Remember, the TV is behaving like a light, and look at how it's actually throwing light up onto the ceiling. Beautiful reflections in the table of not only the TV, but of the window. So from a very brightly lit room, one rendered solution, and with a few alterations, we get down to a more dimly lit room. Again, what I'm hoping that you'll catch on to is that when you create a rendering, and let me see if I can get back to, here we go. So this rendering, if you look across the bottom of the screen, this rendering was completed in 30 passes. That's actually not very many. If we let it go longer, the quality of the rendering would be even better. And the rendering took 34 minutes. So that's not a lot of time, but I believe you'll agree that a rendering that took 34 minutes to complete, when I use some of these really nice IRender nXt features, the tones dialog, the filters dialog, the special effects dialog, and the lighting channels, when I use those features on a finished rendering and can get from one rendering another rendered solution for my presentation, there's no way that took a half an hour. So now I could claim that I got 2 renderings for the price of 1. Everyone is being so quiet. Does anyone have any questions about any of the information that we've covered? If you have, since you installed IRender nXt, if you've used the lighting channels dialog, type yes into the question bar. Now I'm getting a few people who are saying yes, not as many as who had used an HDRI image. Okay, and I'm going to pick on one person here, and I hope I pronounce your name correctly. Devery Brown. Devery Brown, did we do anything to help you understand lighting channels better, or explain things that weren't obvious when you looked at lighting channels? And I'm getting yes, which either means I pronounced Devery's name properly, and so I wanted more in-depth info, yes. That's really nice of you to say, and I hope that was helpful to you. Lighting channels are a very important feature of IRender nXt. We think a big advantage over what might be possible with other renderers. And I can tell you from my experience, if I used a renderer now that didn't have this lighting channels option, I'm not sure that I would be able to get my presentation ready in time, because I've become very dependent on that feature. And similarly, the tone and filters dialog, the idea that I might have to take my rendering out to another imaging program, and there are plenty of really good ones out there, that's not really very appealing to me. I would actually miss those features and would feel like it was just impossible to get a rendering done without those features. Wow, and I'm going to brag now, Devery, because I actually got a gold star because I did pronounce the name properly. So thanks very much for acknowledging that. I'm usually terrible at pronouncing people's names. If anyone else has questions about any of the information that we've covered, this pretty much concludes what I intended to cover this afternoon. I want to mention that on Friday, the best way to get the correct time is to visit our website and look at our webinar schedule. On Friday, we have a webinar scheduled that is going to focus on reflections. So materials and reflections. And we're going to cover that in considerable depth, hopefully give you some very important insight as to how we help you manage reflections properly in your models to achieve photorealism. And let me just point out while we're here that while everything is reflecting, so for example, the thick glass on the table is reflecting, the vase is reflecting, the lamp is reflecting, and these are all treated as very polished surfaces. However, the one exception to that is the floor. The floor actually has some reflective properties turned on, but when I created this model, I wanted the floor to be not a high gloss finish, but more of a satin finish. And so in order to achieve that, I applied some IRender nXt reflection values, and then I adjusted those values so that in my rendered solution, I get exactly the effect on that floor that I want. That's what we're going to teach you how to do on Friday. So if you haven't registered for Friday's webinar, I'm going to encourage you to do so. I think we're going to go over some information that will help you feel very comfortable with managing reflections and again, approach materials confidently with IRender nXt so that you can arrive at renderings that are better than anyone else out there and will help you present the best renderings possible to your clients. So again, visit RenderPlus.com, look for our webinars page, and register for Friday's webinar. With that, if there are no more questions, I'm going to turn everybody loose. I've got a lot of renderings to complete to get ready for Friday. I'm sure you all are chomping at the bit to get back to your models. Good luck. If you have any questions on IRender nXt, anything that we can help you with, please don't hesitate to send questions to support@renderplus.com. There are several of us who are looking for those questions constantly. As soon as we receive them, we do our best to send you some helpful information. So until next time, thanks again for joining us, and let's go get some renderings done.